Hello and welcome back to Bookish. Today I want to do a book review. I want to review How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. I got this book, kind of in the wake of the George Floyd murder and the Black Lives Matter protests, which are still ongoing, as a part of my effort to kind of educate myself further, to get beyond, what I thought I was comfortable with in terms of my thoughts about race, and to try to expand those thoughts and to read more and to learn more. What I expected from the book was that it would be a kind of call to action, a checklist of how I, as a white man, could do more to turn back the tide of racism, to combat racism. I expected it to be kind of militant in its point of view and strident in its language, and sometimes it is, but the book is really so much more than that. What it really is a call for all of us to take up the mantle of anti-racism, to actively work to eliminate and reform policies which have led to racial inequality, to support policies which will undo racial inequality, and to accept that all people of all cultures, of all races, of all ethnicities, of all religions, of all sexual orientations, for all identities, that we accept them all as equal, that we accept those cultures as equal, that we accept their behaviors as equal. And as such, it was a much more powerful book than I expected it to be. In structure, it's an autobiography, kind of tracing Kendi's own journey from racism to anti-racism. Now, Mr. Kendi is an African-American man, but he acknowledges and he puts this story in the framework of his own journey to overcome racist ideas that he had, about African-Americans and African-American culture and how he interacted and what his responsibilities were as an African-American man. His ideas, involving everything you think about in race, and kind of how at each stage of his life he overcame a lot of that racism. At its heart, the book attempts to redefine how we think about racism. So, on the one hand, he points out that racism absolutely exists, and he says, none of us have a problem identifying the individual racist. None of us have a problem identifying the guy, with a Confederate flag, wearing a KKK sign, flag, waving or having a swastika tattoo. We don't have a hard time identifying those racists, and most of us are repelled and find that behavior repugnant. But that isn't enough. What he also points out is that there are racist policies in the United States, and those racist policies are at the heart of racial inequality. He says it's not enough to say you're not a racist. That essentially saying you're not a racist is like saying you're neutral on the issue of racism. And neutral only helps racism to continue. In particular, it only helps racist policies to continue. So what he's encouraging people is to be, anti-racist, to actually be active in supporting things which will overcome racist policies and racist ideas we have in the United States. Because to be an anti-racist is to oppose inequality for anybody, under any circumstances, and to promote policies that will bring that to an end. So that means you have to overcome some pretty powerful racist thinking. And it doesn't matter what your race is. I think he probably writes most powerfully. One of the things that impacted me the most was him talking about overcoming our ideas about kind of group behavior. So I'll just read really quickly for you here in terms of how we use individual actions to label whole groups of people, in this case races of people, with negative attributes, and we put pressure on those groups of people to live up to a higher racial standard, so otherwise they're letting the race down. So I'll just read this paragraph to you really quickly, or part of this paragraph. Making individuals responsible for the perceived behavior of racial groups and making whole racial groups responsible for the behavior of individuals are two of the ways that behavioral racism infects our perception of the world. In other words, when we believe that a racial group's seeming success or failure redounds to each of its individual members, we've accepted a racist idea. Likewise, when we believe that an individual's seeming success or failure redounds to an entire group, we've accepted a racist idea. In other words, that we shouldn't be thinking about that when we think about an African American man who's involved in a crime, we shouldn't think about him as a representative of African Americans. We should think about him as an individual. So he explains his own struggle in kind of overcoming all these things, of overcoming all cultures as equal. He talks about his move from New York to Virginia, and how for a long time he was convinced that the African American culture in Virginia, and the culture in Virginia, wasn't as good as the African American culture in New York. He rejects that idea about individual behavior affecting the groups. He deals with and talks about and kind of rejects the idea of colorism. He confronts his own homophobia and comes out at the other end realizing that all groups have to be considered and treated equally. He deals with the history of how our concepts of race were really created relatively recently. He deals with the ideas of biological or genetic differences between the races. What we're talking about are characteristics of groups of people who share genetic similarities, and that's not really race. He does a good job with all those kinds of things. He makes sure to point out and talk about issues of intersectionality, and to point out that the trans African American community is one of the most abused, one of the most discriminated against, one of the communities that's the most victimized by racism in the United States, by pointing out really staggering statistics about life expectancy for people in those groups. Kendi really lets nobody off the hook. He doesn't let his parents off the hook. He doesn't let his advisors off the hook. He certainly doesn't let himself off the hook. He doesn't let our current administration off the hook. He doesn't let any member of any race off the hook. And what he suggests here is that anti-racism is a constant struggle, that he and I and you and everybody else has to constantly struggle to overcome these ideas that society has created for us about race, and then to promote actual anti-racism. So I thought the book was great. I think it's a really warm-hearted and compassionate call for action and equality, and I don't rank books by stars, but I definitely recommend the book to everybody. Anyway, there you go. That's my review of How to Be an Anti-Racist by Ibram X. Kendi. Look forward to your comments in the comment section below, and as always, thank you for watching.